We are slaying monsters.
Don't let the ghosts and the ghouls disturb you, darling.
I'm just excited to get into the weird shit. I'm really curious what people were thinking about them. This is something, EJ, you had said in an earlier episode that you were exposed to Nazi occultism, like just as like part of life growing up. Like you that was something that you sort of like knew about the Nazis, is that they were into occult practices. I have never encountered this. Not in like my previous life, not in my life extensively studying 20th century European history. Like, I did not know this was a thing. So I just feel like I'm learning a lot.
In your history studies, there was never anything that was like, oh, the Nazis are worshiping demons or anything like that, right? Historically, we never talk about that.
No, we don't talk about it in the historical record because, like, it wasn't true. But like, but it wasn't even mentioned as like a narrative that was said about the Nazis. Like, obviously, that could be something that would be in the historical record. Is like, this wasn't happening, but people said that it was, right? But no.
Well, I mean, you're right. It was never real. Like, the Nazis weren't doing any of that shit. I think that Goebbels was he was kind of into some of the more esoteric practices that were somewhat popular at the time. You know, you had like all of that stuff from Blavatsky and the rising kind of esotericism back then, and he dabbled in it. But
yeah, and like spiritualism was big in the 20s and stuff like that. Yeah,
right. But it wasn't like he was driving the whole party to go out and hold seances to conjure demons or something like that. Like that's completely made up bullshit that came much, much later. Like we talked about in the last episode, starting with Morning of the Magicians, where you had these two authors that were just fancifully making up a new history of the world, and like, what if there were all of these evil forces that were influencing mankind, and what would that mean for Nazis and also all the wars that we had and all this other shit. So yeah. But I mean, today we're gonna start getting into the nature of what these devices were that the rumors are that they were working on, and what the technology was, which is always a fascinating place because a lot of times it's based on real science, but it's based on real science as told by people who are not scientists. And so none of it actually makes any sense in the way that the world actually works and functions, and how science and gravity work in this episode. And we'll get into that. But anyway, we're getting ahead. We're going to have a lot of fun today.
Nice. Oh, and we are slaying monsters. We got Maddie J across the table.
Hey.
We got Katie.
Hi.
And I'm EJ. And we are on to Die Glocke Part 3.
Yes.
Is that drei? Is that right? 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You could also say it in Italian today if you wanted to.
What is 3 in Italian? Oh, come on. You said that and you don't even know?
Toi?
I think that's French.
Yeah, Katie, that's French, isn't it?
It is, yes. Toi is French.
Well, we have trace.
Well, trace is
It's
Spanish.
tray. I
Tray.
just looked it up.
Okay, tray.
Okay.
I know that it's set in Korean.
There you go.
That is Korean as pronounced through my Pennsylvania Dutch accent, because when I learned Korean while doing Taekwondo growing up, and so in my hometown, and so I learned all the Korean I know is Korean filtered through the Pennsylvania Dutch people who were teaching my classes. So.
Yeah, absolutely amazing.
But anyway, before we get too sidetracked, when we last left our increasingly crazy story, Polish journalist Igor Witkowski's journey to find Die Glocke, or the Nazi bell, has been ramping up. Following the threads of neo-Nazi writers like Ernest Zundel and Miguel Serrano has led Witkowski to conclude that the bell, it's gotta be some kind of super advanced technology. But how did the Nazis develop it? And what generated this fantastic leap forward in engineering and aerospace advancement?
Aliens.
Well, spoiler alert from EJ.
Millions of dollars of scientific research money poured into war machines.
Shut up, Katie. What do you know?
Believe it or not, neither of those is correct.
What?
The answer is actually nothing. Nothing. Because despite Witkowski's beliefs, Die Glocke wasn't real.
Shocker. Spoiler alert.
Remember, Nazi Germany, by the end of the war, was a broke, insular, warmongering place. We're talking during the late 30s, the 40s. Money was being spent on weapons that Hitler knew were going to be sure things. V-2 rockets, Panzer tanks, not speculative crafts, not speculative technology. There was no way he was going to divert the funds to it because he was trying to win a war. And you win a war with proven things. Nazi scientists couldn't even beat the Allies to get to nuclear power because they kept exiling their top scientists for being non-Aryan. But the thing is, the simple and truthful answer is hardly ever, I should say, one that the Fortean community accepts. And so Witkowski and other believers in Nazi flying saucers, they began to pore over the old World War II correspondence, and they started looking for references like to flying discs or unknown aerial vehicles. And of course, they found them. Not in Germany, not in Poland, but in Italy. Okay, so in 1996, just a year before Witkowski began his investigation, several packets of documents were distributed to Italian news organizations and Italian UFO writers. One of these journalists was Roberto Pinati, who published them in Italian UFO magazines. These came to be called the Fascist UFO files, and they allegedly came from the Italian government and detailed the crash and recovery of a flying saucer. So the story goes like this. In April of 1933, an unknown craft crashed outside the town of Magenta in the Lombardy region of Italy, like kind of vaguely near Milan. 2 bodies were recovered from that craft. They were described as your typical Nordic aliens. That would be tall, blonde, blue-eyed, almost kind of Scandinavian looking. Very much in keeping with George Adamski's Venusians, and also very much fitting this idea of Hitler's master race, these Aryan people. The Italian military took over the site and moved the recovered craft and the bodies to the SIAI Marchetti Aircraft Company, where engineers began to study them throughout the 1930s. Now, in 1938, Benito Mussolini agreed to share his team's findings with Hitler and Nazi scientists. Once they were in German hands, a combined effort, sometimes with Japanese scientists as well, depending on your source, they managed to reverse engineer that craft. And that yielded a spectacular breakthrough, a new kind of power source that could revolutionize the world. Anti-gravity technology.
This is very early on for a spacecraft crashing with aliens being recovered. I feel like that happens in like the 50s all the time in our like general knowledge of this. This is super early.
Yeah, right. So if we chart the timeline of the public consciousness, especially like the Western world's public consciousness when it comes to UFOs, most of that starts in 1947. That's when we had Kenneth Arnold's first sighting. He talks about seeing them over the Washington Cascade Mountains, a saucer craft skimming across the water. We get the phrase flying saucer. About a month after that, we have the UFO crash at Roswell, and that sort of cements the entire narrative, right? And then a year after that, we have the Aztec crash, which really locks in the mythology of this whole time. So in terms of the timeline here, you're talking about over a decade before this, if these allegations are true.
Yeah, and I just looked it up because I had forgotten, but the War of the Worlds broadcast was in 1938. So that didn't even happen until, in this story, like the technology is, or the studies are being shared amongst the powers or amongst the different governments. So it's so interesting. I mean, it's interesting because obviously someone made it up after the fact. So like, of course it can like make sense, but it is like an early instance. If it was like in the real timeline, it would be an early instance of alien recovery, like you said, EJ.
Right. And you can see, because, all right, so let's take the War of the Worlds broadcast. Now we have, that's probably the first time that UFOs and aliens are entering the public consciousness in like a big way, right? And that is the same year that you have these early access powers starting to share this information. It's easy to make this into a conspiracy theory and say, well, the reason that we had that radio broadcast and the reason that Orson Welles wrote this to begin with was because he heard the stories that were coming out of Italy and Germany.
Oh. Well,
it's not
also,
true,
yeah, of course. Also, sorry, I just looked up because I was curious when Japan became part of the Axis powers, and that was not until September of 1940. So they wouldn't have been sharing it with Japan in 1938, most likely. Unless,
Katie, that is the thing that encouraged Japan to join the Axis powers.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. I see.
You see how this builds, though. You see how we can all kind of build the narrative and figure out how all these things fit together.
Well, here's another problem. Italy and Germany did not sign the Pact of Steel to become the core part of the Axis powers until May of 1939. So 1938 is still 1 year too early. Why can't people making up their conspiracy theories just check a date?
But part of this is that when this the fascist UFO files came out in 1996, information was not as readily available as it is today. Where, I mean, it took you 10 seconds to quickly look up when Italy and Germany.
It's called an encyclopedia.
Yeah,
those were available in 1996.
But it was a lot harder. Like, we didn't have phones. We weren't doing it all the time. If you run into somebody out somewhere, and they're talking to you over dinner or something, you don't know, and it's hard to verify this.
No,
stuff.
totally.
So, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm just making fun and poking holes in retrospect. But to your point, Matt, this was Mussolini's pitch to Hitler to become partners. As he's like, listen, dude, I have this secret information. I'm going to give it to you. And then we're going to be besties in war.
And doesn't that change things in a fascinating way, right? Because instead of Germany being this superior kind of militaristic power who recruits in Italy, you now have Mussolini, who is either saying, yo, I have this thing that would be useful to you, or is saying, I have this thing and we don't know what it is. We need your scientists to come in and help us understand it. Right?
Can I ask a question?
You may.
Is this true?
No.
Or
no, none of this is true.
So all of this is retrofitted, right? Like okay, whether the alien really crashed or not, did Mussolini really believe he had an alien ship and he worked with Hitler on it, or is this all stuff that people made up in the 1990s to make it seem more exciting?
This is all, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but this is all stuff that was made up in the 1990s. We know that pretty decisively, conclusively. The thing about Roswell, and I'll mention this soon. But the thing about Roswell and the other alleged crashes that we have is that most of the time we have a long history of documentation regarding them. Like we have photos of the material that crashed at Roswell. So we know that effectively happened. We have no documentation of the crash in Italy in 1933 until 1996. And so you sort of have to ask the question, is it possible that the government kept this entire thing contained for so long? Maybe, but you would still have some newspaper reporting of, oh, something fell out of the sky. There would be something like that, and we have nothing. So yes, the whole thing was made up in the 1990s.
Okay.
So anyway, we have our Axis powers, they're developing, and they are trying to work on figuring out what this craft is and what the technology is. And ultimately, they're able to determine that it's anti-gravity. They're trying to retroactively understand this, but the project never really got off the ground. When the Allies took over Italy, they found the craft, according to this theory. And Roosevelt immediately sent it to Wright Airfield, which we know today as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the place where allegedly the aliens got sent after the Roswell crash. Realizing the importance of this technology, Roosevelt ordered American scientists to do exactly what the Germans were doing and reverse engineer it. And then depending on how the story goes in whoever's retelling it, they might have been successful. The reverse engineered craft took an unsuccessful flight in July of 1947, leading to a crash on a ranch in Roswell, New Mexico, and the rest is pseudo-history.
Oh, wow.
Okay. I mean, listen, I love a good tie-in.
Yeah.
We just brought it back.
Saucer came full circle.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that repaints not only the UFO crash at Roswell, but the entire World War II aerospace engineering program. Because in this story, there actually was a Wunderwaffen, a wonder weapon. But the Nazis were stymied not by financial woes, not by racism, but by a challenge in understanding extraterrestrial technology. And it means that the Roswell saucer wasn't a weather balloon, wasn't a alien craft, but was a test flight of ex-Nazi technology. And we can even push this as far as saying, well, Bob Lazar wasn't working on the Roswell craft at Area 51. He was actually working on the Mussolini saucer from 1933. But it's all made up. Okay, so to understand how this story comes about, we have to go back to the 1990s for a little bit. So in the 90s, UFOs and aliens were really popular news. And that's thanks to a very complex interplay of news cycles and media combining things like Whitley Strieber's Communion with the X-Files. You had the Ariel School incident, where a school of Zimbabwean children claimed to see a UFO. You had Independence Day, where Will Smith's poignant quote, "Get my planet's name out of your mouth," before he slapped the alien. It's no secret that Hollywood follows trends, right? So that's why today we're getting shit like Minecraft. The 90s was no different. If you want to find out what was popular in the public zeitgeist, just look at the films from the decade. In the 90s, you had Fire in the Sky, Men in Black, Mars Attacks, Stargate, Contact, and on and on and on. Aliens, they were a big thing. Aliens and conspiracy theories, right? So conspiracy theorists, or those pushing these conspiracy theories for gainful reasons, always capitalize on these trends. And 1996 was prime time for alien and UFO conspiracies. So it's no surprise that the fascist UFO files were making the rounds of fringe news groups and authors. They were hot, you know? But there was a precedent for this too. In 1984, this exact thing happened, just like the fascist UFO files, but it happened in the US. And here the secret data wasn't from the 1930s, but from the UFO flap of the 1950s, including the Roswell crash. And It wasn't the fascist files, but the granddaddy of them all, the Majestic 12 documents. How much do you guys know about Majestic 12?
A little bit, because I did a bit of research, but
All right.
I couldn't tell you much.
I know nothing, so I can come in
Cool.
and as the uninitiated today.
But the Majestic 12, that's a group of people, though, right?
Yes.
Okay, but they circulated a bunch of fake documents about UFOs.
Well, Majestic 12, so it's really interesting, and I very much encourage anyone who's listening to this episode but hasn't listened to our last Fortean Roundup to go back and listen to that Fortean Roundup, because everything we talk about in the first news item about how the U.S. government was using aliens and UFO technology as a way to kind of influence and muddy the waters and determine where leaks were happening in the government and all of those things, that's all going to factor in right here today as well. The short version of this story goes like this. In 1984, there was a UFO researcher who was mailed a roll of 35 millimeter film with no return address, just showed up in his mailbox. When it was developed, the film revealed photographs of what were purportedly to be secret documents labeled Majestic 12, part of some type of high-level program that nobody in the government seemed to know about, this Majestic 12. Highly redacted, black lines all over the place. But they apparently detailed how President Harry Truman was aware of a cover-up of the UFO crash at Roswell. These documents ended up in the hands of Bill Moore, who wrote the book on Roswell, literally. In 1980, Moore, along with Charles Berlitz, published The Roswell Incident, which was an alleged expose of the UFO crash at Roswell, the government cover-up that followed, all of this. That book was largely responsible for bringing Roswell into light and into the public consciousness. But there's a big problem with that, because Moore and Berlitz were mostly parroting Robert Spencer Carr, who was a speculative fiction writer. Carr had been talking about crashed saucers and the recovery of bodies and tech for over a decade. Much of that he had stolen from a book called The Fortek Conspiracy, which was published in 1969. That was a speculative science fiction book. It was not a real book.
Oh my God, I love the anthropological chain of these ideas. It's one of my favorite parts of when you do this, Matt. I just want to say. And I also have a question.
Yes.
So this film and these documents actually did go to Bill's house. He actually got them. Okay.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, this is legitimate. He wound up with this roll of film. Yeah. Now, the Fortek Conspiracy, this science fiction book, based much of its plot of a recovered spacecraft and alien bodies on the Aztec UFO crash. That was a hoax by Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer to sell divining rods, which they claimed were alien space tech. And if you want a full deep dive into those grifters and their inevitable arrest, check out our Aztec UFO series. The Fortek Conspiracy was also heavily influenced by Stanton Friedman and his theory that the Roswell crash, which was real, was a spacecraft, not a weather balloon. It was neither, by the way. It was Project Mogul, which was a top-secret high-altitude surveillance balloon. But if we try to get into Roswell, this is going to be 10 episodes long, so put a pin in that. Okay, so recap situation check. Bill Moore wrote a book about Roswell, which was based on the Aztec UFO hoax, then filtered through two science fiction writers. And this was the guy who ended up with these Majestic 12 documents in the 1980s. So he was kind of an authority on flying saucers, but that's a bit like saying that if you watched Thor Ragnarok, you were now an authority on Norse mythology. You might know some names and events, but there's also that whole subplot with Jeff Goldblum and the Hulk as a gladiator. All right, so Moore thought that the documents were authentic. Other researchers, not so sure. Aerospace journalist Philip J. Klass sent them to the FBI, who responded several months later and called them, quote, completely bogus. In fact, if you look them up on the Freedom of Information Act, they're actually stamped with the word bogus. The FBI has a stamp that says bogus that they stamp on these documents.
Wow. They use the word bogus. That's cool.
Yeah.
I love that. I also love a good stamp. I don't think we use enough stamps anymore
We don't. They're so official.
in the organization of documents.
So they also, in their official release regarding the MJ-12 documents, they said this. The Office of Special Investigations, U.S. Air Force, advised on November 30th, 1988, that the document was fabricated. Copies of that document have been distributed to various parts of the United States. So it wasn't just Bill Moore. These were being sent to multiple UFO researchers all over the country in the 80s. But the thing is, that immediately got ufologists' backs up because they're not exactly the most governmental trusting body, right? So they claimed that the FBI was just lying to cover up the truth and that the MJ-12 documents were real.
I find that so interesting. Like, you said that other UFO researchers weren't as sure as Bill Moore about the legitimacy of the documents. But then as soon as the FBI is like, nope, these are fake, they're like, no, they're real now. Definitely real if the government's denied them.
It's very hard to take it all seriously when that's the logical progression.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and this is something that we talked about in our last 40th. Because U.S. government, the FBI came out and said, we've been using UFOs as a psyop, right? We've been using them as a psyop. They were also a hazing ritual. And immediately the UFO community said, why are you lying to us? You know, you can't believe anything that the government says. And anytime the government says something, they assume that it's a lie.
I guess it keeps the organization open and running.
What, it keeps the government? Keeps MUFON open?
Yeah. I mean, it gives them something to do. If you just believe that everything is a lie that comes out of the government, it's like never ending.
And it's also an easy way to move that goalpost. And you never need to actually walk back any of your beliefs or any of your conclusions, assumptions, you know?
Yeah. And I feel like, too, it's because there's not a lot of, like, major alien news that's like happening on the regular to keep the conspiracy going. I think the government denying something is a piece of news that you can use. And if you just assume that they're lying, you're like, look, another cover up. The conspiracy goes deeper.
Now, the thing about the MJ-12 documents, though, is this researcher, Philip J. Klaus, did more digging, and he actually matched Truman's signature on the documents to another memo issued in 1947 and saw that there were scratch marks on Truman's signature that were identical to the scratch marks that were on the MJ-12 documents. So that signature had literally been copied from one document and pasted onto another one.
That was from the documents that were sent to the guy.
Right. Yeah. Giving credence that the MJ-12 documents were faked because the signature on them was a forgery.
Truman's signature, it was an actual signature, Truman's actual signature on like a legit document that they copied and pasted. Got it. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. They were able to determine that signature because there were scratch marks through the through the legitimate signature that were identical on the MJ-12 documents.
Interesting. Okay.
Do you think that better leads to the idea that it did come from the government then? Or could anybody have really done that by taking his signature?
So I will say we legitimately do not know where the MJ-12 documents came from. Okay. Philip J. Klass believed that Moore faked the documents himself to try to convince some of these government agents to actually come forward. He was of the opinion that Moore bought into the MJ-12 documents, bought into the conspiracy, and thought that if he said, hey, I know something, actual government agents would come forward and talk to him about it, or at least tell him, hey, keep all of that quiet. you know, kind of the old fake out of like, oh, I didn't know until you admitted it. Brian Dunning of Skeptoid, however, believes that the MJ-12 documents were all part of a deliberate disinformation campaign designed to root out governmental leaks. And this is kind of what we were talking about in our Fortean. Remember, we're in the Cold War at this point, right? Project Blue Book had been closed for 15 to 20 years, but the government had become convinced that these independent research groups like MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, might inadvertently come upon evidence of advanced weaponry that they incorrectly attributed to alien crafts, but they would still have evidence of this stuff. So what's the best way to address this? Do you go to MUFON and say, you're absolutely wrong, that never existed? Or do you go to MUFON and say, you're right, that's a UFO, don't tell anybody about it?
Yeah. I'm bringing our conversation from our Fortean into this podcast. So listeners, go listen
Definitely
there and you can hear the first part. But I do think it's smart, like just as a pure diversionary tactic on behalf of the government, if that's what's happening, like makes a lot of sense. Pretty simple plan. The problem for me is the whole, like, we're going to figure out who's leaking by putting out these documents, because according to new information, they were doing it to fucking everyone, or they were doing it to a lot of people. So like your plan doesn't really work when you're telling a lot of people, because then your subjects of who's leaking the information could be a lot of people, right? Like that works when you have like 2 or 3 people and you tell them information and then it gets out and you're like, well, one of these 3 people told someone, not one of this entire squadron of the Air Force might have told someone.
I think that part of this is the fact that they're trying to keep the actual amount of people who know the truth as small as possible. And it's better in a way to have a bunch of people who think they know something, but are completely wrong, and a very small amount of people who actually legitimately know something. Like, it's better to have that than it is to have have people believe that you were lying, you know, or be trying to convince people that they're wrong.
Maybe the leaking is the opposite then. So
what do you
the
mean?
way you're finding the leakers is if the actual information gets out, because you know that only 10 people, the heads of like these departments, know what's actually going on versus hundreds of people that you've told the lie to.
Right. So maybe you're not looking for the person who's leaking the UFO information. You're looking for the person who's leaking the legitimate information as a counterpoint to the UFO information.
Yeah.
That's an interesting theory, actually, because that would mean that it would be people who were trying to correct the mistakes or correct the misinformation.
Correct the mistakes, or just like, even if they're not even correcting the mistakes, it's like if a journalist comes out with something legit, you know that there's only, maybe not 10, but you know that there's like 50 people it could have been coming from, or fewer, right?
What if they're like hedging their bets? Like what you said, the legitimate story comes out through the 10 people that know or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, the hundreds of people in that one squad start to talk about the aliens that they know about. And so when all the information comes out, nobody knows what to believe. Everybody's confused. And that information is ultimately, the legit information is ultimately hedged against the crazy stuff. So it's less powerful and less people are prone to believing it, because we like to believe the flashy fun stuff over the more boring legitimate stuff.
Yeah, and I mean you're basically quoting Richard Doty at this point,
okay,
which is great. We can segue right into that.
Okay,
because Bill Moore, who released these MJ-12 documents, basically confirmed that he had been part of a disinformation campaign with the U.S. Air Force in 1989. He, along with Richard Doty, had been pushing false information to UFO researchers like Paul Benowitz, who was the founder, or not the founder, but the originator of the Area 51 mythos. Benowitz was driven to a mental breakdown by Doty and Moore's false information. They actually gave him so much that he kept trying to get people to believe him. Nobody would believe him, and it caused him to have a mental breakdown.
That's really uncool.
It's sad.
And this was Doty's modus operandi. Doty believed that you muddy the waters as much as possible. You get out there and you spread as much misinformation as possible because that keeps your secret safe.
You're basically allowing the everyday citizen to do your job for you, which is very smart.
Pretty much.
Much less effort on your part.
Yeah. To this day, as I said, we don't really know where those MJ-12 documents came from. Philip Klass found there were similarities in the date format used with them that were very similar to a formatting that Bill Moore often used. That's day, month, year, which is uncommon in the U.S. Does that prove anything? Not really. They also found that there was a superfluous comma usage in the MJ-12 documents that also seemed to tie it with Bill Moore. But there again, can we prove that just because Bill Moore liked commas? I don't really think so. It's not really a smoking gun.
I can tell you, too, that day, month, year is often used in scientific channels.
For sure, yeah.
So, like, anytime you're writing a scientific, like, you're writing in a lab notebook or something, for example, you're going to write day, month, year. That's just the way that they do things. So maybe he's...
Do you know if that has been true for the last, 50 years, though?
I don't know that, actually. I know that's how they do it now, but I mean, probably, but I don't know.
Because the allegation is that format was being used in these documents from the 40s and the 50s, and that was uncommon in the U.S., and therefore would not have been on governmental correspondence from that. But
so it's uncommon in the government at that time.
Right.
That's important. Okay.
But there again, just because Bill Moore used it, I'm not sure that you can directly link them to Bill Moore. It's just the fact that Bill Moore admitted to spreading misinformation to UFO researchers, and he ended up with it. But it's always possible that he didn't know that he was spreading misinformation. It's a whole big question mark. We don't really know.
Yeah.
So what do the MJ-12 documents have to do with the fascist UFO files from Italy? Everything. Less than a decade after those documents, the MJ-12 documents made headlines, in the midst of a global obsession with aliens and governmental cover-ups, documents appeared that claimed an event remarkably similar to the Roswell crash happened in Italy. But like I said, we had newspaper reports on Roswell. We have that famous photo of Major Jesse Marcel holding parts of the craft. We have legions of conspiracy theories over the past 70 years linking the debris with something else. None of that comes out of Magenta before 1996. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible to keep something like that under wraps, but when stories like this pop out of nowhere and there's no discernible paper trail, we have to be suspicious of them. And the timing, being reported shortly after the MJ-12 documents in almost the same fashion, makes it seem like the same story. Deliberate disinformation passed to a UFO group to find out what leaks are going on here.
Wait, so you think the fascist files were also a way to find leakers? Like it wasn't just like a story people made up because it was part of this other narrative about like German military super prowess or something?
I suspect that they were probably Italy trying to do the same thing that the US government did. Yeah. Yeah, I suspect so. That's just my theory. That's not really based on anything. But yeah.
Okay. So this leak came out of Italy.
Out of Italy, yes.
Oh, got it. Okay. Mm-hmm.
But to Igor Wachowski, that was a very tantalizing bit of evidence of Die Glocke, the Nazi Wunderwaffen. And that, to him, said this was based on real technology. The question now, of course, is what the fuck was this thing? Was it a flying craft? Was it a weapon? Was it a spacecraft? Remember that Witkowski was going on a series of meetings with this anonymous historian, this German historian, who we don't know who it is. He never gives a name, but they had all these meetings. Witkowski put together a picture of the bell's purpose. Allegedly, you ready for this? It was 2 cylinders that spun in opposite directions, generating opposing forces. These cylinders surrounded a core made of some unknown but incredibly strong metal filled with a liquid like mercury. That entire structure was housed in a ceramic form which created this bell shape and gave it its name. And the spinning engine was powered by a thick electrical cord which extended from the cap of the bell, the top of it.
Had to be plugged in?
Yeah, it had to be plugged in.
That is so old-fashioned thinking. I love that. Oh my goodness.
Okay, so you plug it in, right? You power it on. The energy generated was so destructive that it could only be operated in an underground pool. The pool was ceramic lined and covered with rubber mats, which were destroyed by the massive energy surge during each test. So every test they had to drag out more rubber mats and cover the bell. The observers wore rubber suits with helmets and visors to protect them, but they still suffered ill effects from turning the bell on. Numbness, headaches, sleep disturbance, and memory lapses.
Why is rubber a protective thing? I mean, I know like rubber absorbs shock and stuff, but like rubber doesn't do shit against like, I don't know, other stuff.
Well, I guess there's no radiation involved, right? Obviously, it's all like electric powered and mercury.
They don't talk about radiation.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting, and we're late on this train, but we just watched Chernobyl, the series on HBO.
Oh my God, it's so fucking good.
I know.
So fucking good.
I know. We hadn't watched it when it first came out, and we were in a media lull, and we were like, "Oh, we should watch this," and then we did. So, anyway, but
so good. Okay, anyway,
we can talk about it.
Yeah, we can talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to me how similar this does seem to like emerging atomic power at the time. Yeah, like you give this idea an impression of like this huge, massive energy power, and you need to be completely protected by it, and you have to do it in this special containment unit, and things are going to get destroyed in the process. It feels very atomic tech, right?
I need to look up when the first nuclear facility came about, because So when are we talking with the bell? It's like,
well, Witkowski's research is in the 90s.
Yeah,
it's
all
about
right.
98.
But when does he think that the bell was being developed? Like during the war, or was it
During
sort
the
of
war.
Earlier? During the war, like in the
concurrently.
40s?
Yeah, concurrently with the Manhattan Project. So the
Okay.
or early 1940s is what his anonymous historian is telling him about it.
Yeah, I think it's so funny what you said, EJ, about something being plugged in is so old school. I feel like that's what's funny about these conspiracy theories is there's parts of them that are just like, that's not how that would go. But also, maybe, because, well, like if you look at old, legitimately, like the first NASA missions, some of the shit that the spacecraft were held together with, you're like, that can't be what we sent to the moon. And it's like, oh no, it was. Some duct tape and some weird abacus shit to do math. And you're like,
well,
wait, what?
They were using abacuses, right? They had them there. They were or slide rules. They were doing slide rules all their math. Yeah.
Yes, I want to laugh at it being plugged in, but I'm like, the spacecraft we sent to the moon that came back safely, when you look at it today, looks like it was literally held together with like spit and tape. And you're like, how did this go into space? I don't know, but it worked. So
it is quite amazing. Now, according to Wikipedia, the Obninsk nuclear power plant was the first one in the USSR, is the first one ever put into place in 1954.
1954. Okay. So at this point in his book, Witkowski devolves into wild speculation of the physics related to the bell. I've seen this kind of thing frequently with conspiracy theory pieces where the authors load up real science and they juxtapose it with theoretical physics using just enough to make it seem plausible, but also making it way too complex for most lay people to understand. So let's just skip all that and jump to the conclusion, okay? Witkowski believed that Die Glocke was an anti-gravity device. Now, anti-gravity is one of those sci-fi terms that gets thrown around a lot. And I'll caveat this with, I am not a physicist, but as I understand it, here's the basic principle of anti-gravity. Since the dawn of flight, the greatest problem has been a limitation based around the energy required to push an object into flight. So in order for a rocket to break Earth's gravitational force, you need to generate a certain amount of thrust, and that thrust requires fuel. The more thrust you need, the more fuel you need, increasing exponentially, and that increases the weight of the rocket, right? The additional fuel makes it heavier, requires more fuel because it gets heavier. So ultimately, you end up with these diminishing returns. The same is true of battery tech to a certain extent. Heavier objects require heavier batteries to lift them. Bigger batteries require more lift, and more lift requires bigger batteries, and on and on and on. One of the proposed ways to circumvent this limitation is the theoretical idea of anti-gravity. Essentially, if we were able to figure out a way to offset the mass of an object, creating a negative mass version, that object would likely respond inversely to natural forces. And if that was true, we could make that negative mass repel the object, generate potentially unlimited thrust from that without the need for growing fuel systems or batteries. So in lay terms, think of it this way. If you have an apple in one hand and a negative apple in the other, and you let both of them go at the same time, the apple falls to the ground because of gravity. But the negative apple would float upwards because it responds inversely to gravity because it's a negative apple. Okay?
Yeah, so as long as you have like the rudders, for lack of a better word, to steer yourself through space, you can go indefinitely.
Right, yeah. Because in my example, take an apple, your regular apple, put it on top of the negative apple, let them both go. The positive apple, the real apple, is pulling down toward the ground. The negative apple is responding inversely and pushing up away from the ground, and so they just hover in midair.
That's really cool.
Okay. So that's basically what anti-gravity is.
I was thinking it more as like a solution to deep space travel in my brain. I was like, okay, because we're always looking for a way to have like unlimited thrust power across space, and we don't have that really.
Well, but also,
so
isn't there no gravity in space? So like the anti-gravity wouldn't really like do anything.
I guess it wouldn't work.
Correct. Yeah.
So then
the
I guess it's not really a solution.
And again, I'm not a physicist, but the way I understand it is once you're in space, you're okay because there's no gravity, but there's also no friction, right? Or very little friction. And so what happens is if you launch an object into space and send it forward, there's nothing really to stop it from going forward. It'll just travel indefinitely. Okay. Right? So
we just lose touch with our things. I think the issue with those long range satellites or like missions that we send, it's two things. One, like we put batteries and things on them to run the equipment that's sending us photographs and stuff. And like eventually those batteries die and we have no way to like recharge them or keep them going. So we just lose touch with the craft. And then also I think eventually they get so far away that like we can't, like our technology isn't good enough for us to like get the information back anymore. But I might be wrong on that second one. It might just be that their batteries die eventually after they've been gone for 5 years or whatever. Like,
yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I imagine that ultimately there is some limit to the amount of how far the signals can travel eventually, because you end up in a place where a signal might take a couple of years to get back and then more and more years So eventually you have something that's sending signals back, but we're not actually going to get them for 100 years, right?
Right.
If it can still do that based around the battery that's in it. And then once you're in space, it's easy. You don't need much force to send you in a direction, and you'll travel in that direction.
Right. I'm dumb. Yes, of course. I realized that.
No,
I'm
it's fine,
sorry.
it's fine.
I was like, of course there's no gravity in space.
I can't tell you how long I actually spent reading things on anti-gravity to understand this shit, to be able to write this intelligently.
It's really like confusing. But okay, so this is in reference to like a flying saucer that can kind of hover.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
The other thing I was thinking that might be an interesting usage for it, right, is that maybe if you can't get the anti-gravity like to fully work, what you could do is what you said, Matt, offset the mass, so that like, let's take like a semi. If you want to make electric trucks, giant trucks, you can make the truck, even though it's still made of the same materials, a lot lighter, so that the battery that you have to use for the truck, either like the same battery will power the truck for a lot longer, or you can use much smaller, lighter batteries to do the same thing that you could before.
That'd be so awesome.
You're 100% correct, Katie. So right now, I can't push a car, right? But if we had a way of offsetting the car's mass, so the car was hovering in air and didn't weigh anything, I could push that car. Mm-hmm. And so that's the idea. You know, the problem with getting to space is that the rocket weighs so much. Well, if we could make the rocket weigh nothing, then it would be really easy to generate the amount of thrust that would be needed to break through the atmosphere and get it out into space. Same deal with planes, same deal with everything, right? Okay. Anti-gravity. So that's what it was, allegedly. Igor Wachowski thinks that's what Die Glocke was a big anti-gravity device. Okay. The issue with anti-gravity is that it's more of a thought experiment than an actual actionable thing. So we talked about a negative apple. Consider a negative bucket. Instead of a 1-gallon bucket, you have a negative gallon bucket. Mathematically, we can incorporate that into word problems all day, but good luck trying to make one and sell it. So the first person to propose this idea of anti-gravity and that it was impossible was Einstein. And just recently, he might have actually been proven right. In 2023, CERN proved that antimatter, our anti-apple, actually responded to gravity exactly the same way as regular matter, our normal apple. They created anti-hydrogen by inverting the protons and electrons. But according to Live Science, quote, the new research ultimately proved that atomic anti-hydrogen is pulled downward due to gravity instead of upward, like you might expect with a form of matter that presents as the opposite of normal matter.
Oh no, bummer.
No, oh my God. Sometimes when I hear about stuff like this, I'm like, I wish that I had been exposed to more of this when I was younger, because oh my God, it's so cool. Why was I a dumb historian? I should have been a scientist, an astrophysicist. No, I don't know. I should have been doing this shit. Like,
this is
Katie.
the weird fringes of science for sure. Yeah.
I don't care. New career.
Yes.
There's still time.
I'm just going to have to restart college because I don't even know basic science things. That's cool. Just another 15 years of school, you know? No, less than that. Your typical science PhD is only about 5 years, actually. So really, in 10 years, I could do a new undergrad, new PhD, maybe throw a master's in there. So maybe 6 years. So maybe 10 years. 10 years, I could be a scientist.
You're good.
I know you can do it, Katie.
New career.
It's decided on this podcast. Breaking news, everyone.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, Matt. Keep going.
Yeah, stack up those letters after your name.
Yep.
Oh, it's so cool, though.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so like in our example now, if you held your apple and your negative apple and you released both of them, they would both fall to the ground and smash.
And that's the reality.
It seems to be based around what CERN did in
Because this is all
2023.
theoretical science, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Einstein, why did Einstein say it was impossible? Do we know? He just like theorized that it was?
That's beyond my comprehension. But yes, based around
Okay.
whatever Einstein's understanding of the world was, he
Right.
didn't believe that anti-gravity and antimatter would behave in the same way that matter did. Or he did believe that it would behave in the same way that matter did, not in a
Right.
manner antithetical to matter.
Okay.
Anyway, okay. So Igor Wachowski, was no more of a physicist than any of us. Having stumbled on these Die Glocke stories, and now thinking it might be the key to some new form of energy, he ended up way out of his depth, kind of like us. And so he needed more scientific minds than his to test his theories, and maybe help him trace the roots of the bell to a test facility in Poland. Because, let's be honest, you can't build and test a weapon or anti-gravity device of this magnitude and not have some evidence behind. Now, Wachowski believed that he had found that, or at least evidence of a footprint of it, deep in the tunnels of Project Risa. But not just anywhere in the complex, in perhaps the most iconic section of all, underneath a castle. Kashaz Castle, this towers over the Pelznica River Gorge in Silesia. It is the third largest castle in Poland. 400 rooms, 11,000 square miles of property.
Whoa.
11,000 square miles.
I thought you were going
This
to
is
say
including,
feet
like,
right
upward,
there.
Right.
Yes, yeah. Originally built during the 13th century, it lasted through a series of battles and rebuilds, and it has this kind of schizophrenic architectural style if you look at it. Some of the rooms are like newly modified into Renaissance style, focus on symmetry, geometry. Others, you have these old Gothic stylings with huge rooms and the pointed archways.
I so badly want to go because I bet you could walk all over and follow the whole architectural story of like from the 1200s all the way up to probably like the Renaissance or whenever they stopped building it.
Up to modern day.
Modern
It was
day.
still owned by nobility in the 1930s.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I would love to go see that. Oh my God.
Bet it's
can we
so
go?
cool.
It's really
Yes.
cool. So in the 1930s, it belonged to Hans Heinrich XV, a ridiculously wealthy Polish noble. Heinrich was pouring money into restoring this castle and sunk a pretty generous portion of his inherited wealth into other real estate and mining developments. Then the Great Depression hit, and the over-leveraged Heinrich got hit particularly hard, and he ended up deeply in debt. Poland seized half of his assets, including the castle. In World War II, when the Nazis took over Poland, they seized the castle again. Project Risa took a particular focus on the property, with the intention of creating a residence for Hitler below the foundation. They needed workers to do that, of course, so the project was staffed with men from the nearby Gross Rosen concentration camp.
I don't feel bad because, hot take warning, everyone. I don't think there should be billionaires, and I'm not sympathetic to the incredibly wealthy. Like, you have enough. You can just take a seat. However,
Damn straight. Yes.
However, I do kind of feel bad for the descendants of people whose relatives 1 generation, 2 generations back were insanely wealthy, right? Like, your generation, if you manage this money properly, even just normally, like, your generations to come will never have to work, will be fine, whatever. And they just fuck it up. Like,
Yeah.
And then you're like the grandkid of this person, and you're like doing whatever, your normal ass job. And you're like, I was a fucking Heinrich.
Yeah,
Like-
I could have had a castle.
Yeah, and like Anderson Cooper has done fine. He's wealthy on his own. He's famous, and I'm sure all of his part of his connections like got him part of what he has and all of that. And like, so you know, he's doing fine, and he also seems like a nice person and all of that. However, he's one of these people. Like,
Yeah, he is.
he's a fucking Vanderbilt, and like
Yeah.
his grandfather, or grandmother, someone fucking just went off and like spent all of their money, and now he like had to be a normal person with a normal job. Not a normal person. I think he was raised very like well-to-do or like privileged, but like still, I just like think about that. There's got to be a part of you that's like, Jesus fucking Christ.
Yeah. Had to be my generation.
It had to be me.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I feel that way about all the Russians, the Russian royalty before the Bolshevik Revolution, and like the French Revolution. All those people that were just like their kids are fucked because like democracy won, and well, not in the Russian sense, but at least in you know there were takeovers, there were regime shifts, and I'm like, oh man, it's not your fault, but oh well.
Yeah, and like I'm not mad about it. Like
No.
I'm glad that happened. But
Yeah.
you know, you just think of it. I just think about it sometimes, and I'm like, that really sucks. Anyway, sorry. A little aside on like Heinrich losing his castle. Back to the bunker that the Nazis were building for Hitler.
So yeah, and now for all the reasons that we've talked about leading up to this, the Nazis wanted to go underground. And so they launched into this huge Project Risa to build an underground bunker. It was going to be partly Hitler's residence, partly, you know, meeting areas, maybe some weapons testing grounds, development, all these things. And they were centering it on this Castle Kashaz. This was going to be the seat, the Nazi seat for the Project Reset. These tunnels that they were working on were massive. They were designed to be big enough to drive a truck through. Some historians have even speculated that they might have been the blueprint for an underground subway that was never finished, that was going to connect different towns underneath Poland. They were all accessed by what must be the world's most terrifying elevator. Went down 50 meters or 150 feet below ground. And the complex underneath the castle itself spans nearly 3,000 miles.
Wow. And this like exists. They definitely built this.
You can go see them. Yeah. So there were, I think, 5 different areas that they started construction on Project Risa. And you can go down in the tunnels of some of these places. Yeah.
The more I hear about the significance of this castle and everything, the more I realize that Hitler and the Nazis definitely picked it so that they wouldn't get bombed.
I mean, that's definitely what it seems like.
Yeah.
It was partly that. It was partly the fact that they wanted to be clandestine in what they were working on. Like it was some self-preservation for Hitler himself. And then I think it was also some, you know, we were hitting armaments. We were hitting like weapons construction facilities and those types of things. If you could move those underground, they'd be safe from flyover bombings.
But they're not going to bomb a beautiful castle.
Very true.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, we talked in one of the previous episodes about how we were specifically trying to preserve, Katie, you talked about that, how we were specifically trying to preserve these properties
Yeah.
from attacks.
Yeah. They There were like literally army units whose job it was to go in and try to say to the bombers, like, don't bomb here because there's like an old church or landmark of historic significance. Yeah.
Good for
so
them.
I think that's true, EJ. Like, and I'm sure the Nazis knew they were doing it. So they were like,
Totally.
extra protection. Like,
Totally, yes.
We still don't know exactly what the purpose of these structures were, these tunnels. It could have been housing for the SS and military officers. It could have been a bunker or residence for Hitler. It could have been weapons testing, design. It could have been a basis for a subway. We talked a little bit about that. Or it could have been a way to transport their riches clandestinely. Since the end of the war, rumors had started to circulate not just about the Nazis' armaments, but about their ill-gotten gains. The story goes like this. At some point toward the end of the war, the Nazis tried to relocate all of the shit that they had stolen from neighboring countries. They're being attacked by all sides. Their boundaries are starting to fall, and so their only hope was to preserve their dwindling wealth. They loaded everything that they could on an armored train in Wrocław, Poland, and sent it to Silesia. From there, it departed to Waldenburg, but it never arrived. Do you know this story, the Nazi gold train? Anybody?
I do. I did a little reading on it.
Well, not exactly.
Okay. I mean, I know the Nazis stole tons of shit, and there was a lot of effort, like particularly artworks and things like that. There was a lot of effort to recover them. In theory, it sounds like this could have been something they did, but it seems like a lot of effort when you're losing the war, and there are a lot of other places that you need to be putting your effort.
Also, to put it all in one basket, to put it all on a big old gold train.
On one train. Yep.
One train that can be easily bombed by an overhead.
So the fate of this train remains very debated by historians and treasure hunters. Some people say it was abandoned and captured. Some people say there was a mutiny and there were turncoat soldiers who fled with the contents. Some people believe it was diverted on an unmarked rail line into underground tunnels where it connected to the complex of Katzel-Kashaz. Now, immediately following the war, in 1946, there was a memo that was sent to Emerson Bigelow of the U.S. Treasury. No relation to Robert Bigelow, as far as I can tell. That memo alleged that the Vatican had confiscated 350 million Swiss francs and was in the process of transferring even more of that through various channels. That money that the Vatican had allegedly came from the Nazis.
That's not surprising. Hitler had a good relationship with the current pope at that time. Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but
I don't know, but I know that, yeah.
I read that the Pope wrote letters to Hitler and was like, "You're doing a good job."
Oh, they were pen pals.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church has so much fucking money that, like, it wouldn't be that weird for them to, like, have more money. Like, it's just like you wouldn't notice it almost, I feel like.
So this memo remained classified until 1997, when it was released in a declassification release. Investigations into the veracity of the memo found out that it only came from a, quote, trusted source. That's all we have. The Vatican denied ever having such Nazi gold. Multiple attempts to sue for restitution were lobbied and overturned in court. Did it go to the Vatican? Who knows? In 2015, a pair of treasure hunters made headlines claiming that they had heard the deathbed confession of a man who knew the location of the gold train. A team of geologists and metal detectorists scanned the Owl Mountains, and they were looking for this alleged secret place, but they came up empty-handed. No train, no gold.
A train just doesn't disappear underground. If it had gone underground, there's like, 3 tunnels? I don't know. There's a lot of tunnels, but like you could look at all the tunnels. You could physically go through and see, is there a train in any of these tunnels? And it's not like the ocean. It's where it's like so vast and a ship can just like fall to the bottom and we're never going to find it. Or, it can move around and get shifted with currents and all this kind of thing. If you haven't found it, the likelihood is it's not there.
Yeah.
And maybe it never was.
Right. And then, of course, now we have things like LiDAR. I know you're going to get to this, but you can search through other means and it's not an unlimited space, like Katie said.
I mean, the thing is, sometimes when it comes to these theories, you have to even ask, is there anything there worth investigating to begin with?
There you go.
To me, I think the whole story of the Nazi gold train is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate. There have been searches for it for a long time. No one's ever found anything. I do think that the rumor of the stolen priceless art, valuables, all this gold and stuff dovetails very nicely with the fascination with Nazis following the war. Because they're, again, like, they had to have money of some kind, right?
They did, and they 100% stole shit, and they 100% moved it around toward the end of the war. Like, they definitely did that. There's a documentary, I mentioned it before, about art that the Nazis stole from people. And they 100% were, like, hiding it in caves and, like, moved it around and all that kind of stuff. So, like, they were definitely doing that, which makes sense. You think you're losing a war, people are moving in, so you're moving it from, like, unsafe locations to safer locations. So I kind of agree with you, Matt. Like, this just feels like a blown up mythical version of, like, what they were probably clearly doing, but trying to fit it into some bigger story that doesn't really need to exist in the first place.
Yeah. I think it gives them almost this, like, pirate mythology to them, which to me fits very much with the shifting attitude that we had toward the Nazis after World War II. Same kind of culture that built Morning of the Magicians, that book that we talked about that detailed the Nazis and their occultism, right? We begin to question the motives that could propel this population to condone genocide, and so we make them thieves. That just kind of seems logical, right? You know? This concept, they're plunderers. They're disappearing into the night with priceless pieces. You can find those pieces if you just look in the right place. You know, it gives this kind of intrigue to this culture. The sad truth of it, I think, is that most of the missing art and artifacts were probably destroyed during the war. When the Nazis ransacked places, yeah, I mean, they took stuff, but they also melted down a bunch of shit and made their own, Nazi memorabilia, right? We know for a fact that they were pulling gold fillings from concentration camp victims and they were melting them into gold bars. It seems logical to assume that there were other artifacts that met exactly the same fate. And a good portion of it didn't even exist in Germany at that time. There was a 1990s study that revealed that the Swiss National Bank received something in the neighborhood of like $440 million in Nazi gold. And another 300 million of that was transferred to other neutral allies of the Nazis, like Portugal and Spain.
Okay, so to me, just to ask a question here, I don't know how then the Nazis could cry poverty, or how we can retroactively look back and say, oh, they were losing money, they had no money. But where did this money come from? They clearly had some money if they were giving it to Swiss banks. Like, what?
I don't think that that's a lot of money for a war, though.
Yeah, agreed.
When you're talking about weapons development, I mean, that seems like a lot of money until you think about the fact that the entire country is at war.
Is that in today's money, or is that in that time's money?
I believe that was in that time's money.
Okay.
Just for reference, because we talked about the V2 missile that they had.
Yes.
It was like a early ballistic missile, and they didn't use very many of them because they were so expensive to make. Mm-hmm. They cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks per unit in January of 1944, which was later reduced to 50,000 Reichsmarks by March of 1945. This translates to roughly $4.4 million per rocket, accounting for inflation.
Gotcha.
That's per missile, to make that missile. So it's like... And then you're talking about all the infrastructure. You're talking about paying all your military. You're talking about like
feeding people,
like Hitler and his officers and stuff, trying to still live in luxury. I'm sure that I don't actually know how he lived. I know he was vegan, but like 440 million in 1944 would be worth approximately 8.2 billion today.
Wow.
Okay, but I was just reading the new budget bill that's going through the House and the Senate right now, they have allotted $45 billion to Customs and Border Patrol and ICE in this new budget.
Ew.
Yes, it's a huge increase in their budget, and we can leave this for another time since this is not a political podcast. Our thoughts on
not
that.
a political podcast, but
Getting angry.
Getting angry, but but my point is, of course, $8.2 billion is a lot of money for like an individual person to own, but $8.2 billion is not actually that much money in accounting for governmental spending, especially on military things and
At
a war.
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, that's great. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it is hard to say in one breath the Nazis were hemorrhaging money and the Nazis were transferring $500 million in gold to their allies. But yeah, I mean, it is insane how much war costs.
Oh, yeah.
I just looked up the cost of a Panzer tank was roughly $100,000. One Panzer tank, and you don't have one, like you have thousands of them.
Well, listen,
You know.
I mean, I played Call of Duty World War II, and there were a lot of Panzer tanks.
Yes,
in that
there
war.
were.
Yes.
Also, I think we're not thinking about the fact that, like, because we're so focused on where Hitler was, which was like Germany and Poland, like really in Western Europe. But World War II was a world war. They had soldiers in Africa. They had soldiers in Australia. They had soldiers in Asia. Like, so this Pacific front. So like, there's not just like all the weaponry and all the mechanisms of that. It's like the physical act of getting all of that military to like different parts of the world. Like, that's expensive, and like continuing to feed them.
So what happened to this money? Because we only found out about this in the 90s when we actually looked back at where some of these finances came from. It seems that money has been lost through various trails, which is to say that it just kind of throughout the 40s and intervening decades got entangled into the regular flow of finances in post-war restoration. And so it's just gone. And that is, I think, more of where the Nazis had their finances rather than just having a whole bunch of gold stashed in a bunker somewhere. You know, it makes more sense that it was in banks, not in physical objects. But this is a rich place for conspiracy theories, these Nazi gold, because we don't have a paper trail for the Nazi gold. We have no idea. It probably wasn't real, but let's set that aside for a moment. That Nazi gold is off book. And so it's the perfect foundation when we ask questions, how do these black budgets come about? Well, maybe they're funded by Nazi gold.
Do you mean United States black budgets?
I mean conspiracy theory black budgets.
Oh, okay.
Right,
Okay,
right.
gotcha.
Because theoretically, we're saying, okay, the Nazis had some anti-gravity technology. Maybe let's run with our original theory, the 1933 Mussolini UFO, right? Well, that was repossessed by the Allies. That allegedly came to America. That allegedly got reconstituted into the UFO crash at Roswell, right? Well, we don't have a monetary paper trail for deconstructing a fucking UFO that we stole from Italy. There's nothing. We don't have a bunch of finances that went to mysterious UFO project, right? So the idea here is that the finances for that also came from Nazi Germany. They came from this stolen Nazi gold that we got. At least that's how the conspiracy theory goes.
Because it does frame it as like there was physical gold. Like,
Right.
you know, Scrooge McDuck with his like
Yes.
Yeah.
like diving into his swimming around in his gold coins in DuckTales kind of situation. When I think you're right, Bat, like it was just in banks. Like
It was
that
banks,
amount of money is, it's the same way that amount of money like sort of appears and evaporates today. It's just in banks floating around. Like a lot of times these types of valuations, like they don't ever necessarily even exist in physical
Yes.
bills. if someone had to produce them, then yes, like people can produce the physical bills or the gold bars or whatever. But like a lot of wealth does not exist in a physical form. It exists theoretically.
Yeah.
And then
you're leveraging credit, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not
and
real.
like probably the Nazis were doing that too. Very likely they were.
Yeah, they were. The rumors of this literal rail line filled with gold running into subterranean tunnels fit perfectly with the narrative that Witkowski was building for himself. Because that means we have an underground complex. It exists. That is the home where Nazis can develop their anti-gravity bell. But to solve this mystery, Igor Witkowski would need to go on his own expedition to these sites. And we will talk about his findings and the ever-expanding reputation of Die Glocke in our final episode. Dun dun dun!
Cool.
So the next one's going to be a big one because he's finally going to get boots on the ground and he's going to go to these sites.
He's gonna
and
find
look for the
it.
bell.
Oh man,
gonna
didn't Josh
find
Gates didn't Josh Gates do an episode on the Nazi gold?
I think he did.
Yeah.
It's one of these great ideas. There's all of these treasure hunt kind of things, these missing riches somewhere that they just never were real. You know?
That's what I hate about these shows. That's why I have a hard time watching like Expedition Unknown and Josh Gates shows, because there's never really anything there. And it's like always going to be disappointing. And I think Josh Gates has a great personality and I think he's fun to watch and everything. But like, I'm always so disappointed. I'm like, you're never going to find it.
I don't know. You watched the Blackbeard one, didn't you?
Yeah, that was the best one.
I think his Blackbeard was fascinating. Have you watched Expedition Unknown, Katie?
Yeah, not very many. So like, but I kind of have the same feeling as EJ. Like I want to like it because I like Josh Gates. I think he's really fun and entertaining to watch. I like the idea of exploring things that are potentially a little bit more real than like ghosts and goblins. Like he does do some of that sometimes. Like he does do a little bit of the supernatural, but I feel like a lot of times his things are like, hey, there's a rumor that there was like a crash here, or that this happened here, or like these ancient sites. And it's always really disappointing. And I also feel like even in this, when they try to set it up, you're like, and hundreds of people have been here before you, and they have also not found anything. You know, like,
I don't know. The
Blackbeard one is good though.
The Blackbeard one was great because he basically proves that Blackbeard did have treasure there that has been unrecovered, but his treasure was that he was participating in the slave trade. And so the quote unquote treasure that he was carrying was actually enslaved people who
made him a lot of money.
Made him a bunch of money, but you're never going to find that anywhere, right? So I think that was a great episode. That was a wonderful understanding of the history of Blackbeard and all of that. And yeah, again, didn't just end with like, whoop, I guess we couldn't find anything, but was actually hey, this is what was going on during the Age of the Sail. Pirates participated in it too, and
why
maybe
we're
just
Totally.
You're just thinking about treasure wrong. You know, what our modern day is like, haha, we have a chest that's full of doubloons. And it's like, no, they were transporting a lot more than just gold ingots.
Yeah.
Right?
They were stealing people.
Yeah, and they were also stealing crops, and they were stealing, like piracy existed more than just gold.
Yeah, anything
you know?
goes with piracy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. They were stealing valuable goods, whatever
Exactly.
whatever
that
form
means.
that was taking. And in the 1700s and the 1800s, that was human people. Yeah, that's interesting. I like that too. I do think that's one of the things that I like about this podcast and about more nuanced versions of people who think about supernatural or think about the supernatural, or think about, like Josh Gates thinking about like these rumors and legends that exist in the world, is that like oftentimes if you think about it a little differently, instead of thinking about it literally, you can actually learn a lot about the societies or the time periods that these things took place in.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And I think that that often opens the doors to help you understand the truth behind many of these things. You know, because we tend to think about things in a very modern mindset. But if you can understand what was actually going on culturally, sociologically at that time, a lot of times that helps explain these sometimes unexplainable things. Right?
What are people in the future going to think about early stories of like AI girlfriends? They're going to be like, wait, they had relationships with the computer?
I mean, we kind of do that.
You know what I think they're going to say? They're going to say, wait a minute, they had relationships with each other? That's weird.
Oh, EJ, dark. Let's end it there.
Yeah. That's enough of that shit. All right, next time we're going to bring it home, and we are going to conclude our investigation on this Nazi occultism and Die Glocke.
Cool.
And we're going to talk about some of my all-time favorite conspiracy theories.
Nice.
Ooh, love that.
Cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And we'll catch you next time.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Be safe out there. Thanks for listening to Slaying Monsters, the 40 in History podcast. If you like the podcast, there's a couple ways you can show your support. You can tell your friends, you can leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform, or you can head over to slayingmonsterspodcast.com and click on the Support Us button to leave a donation. For questions, suggestions, and other feedback, reach out to us, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com, and stay up to date by following us on socials @slayingmonsterspodcast. Your support helps us grow, and we are truly grateful to have our listeners and community.